Kia ora e te whānau Aotearoa. Today I am here with Cynthia Hancox, who is a home educator here in New Zealand. How are you, Cynthia?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
That's good. Great to hear. Hey, now, Cynthia, before we get started, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your background and maybe some of your passions.
Okay, so I started homeschooling my own children back in the early 1990s. I've got 5 kids. They're all adults now. And I started helping other families get started, as I got more experience and so on. And so since 2016, when my youngest child finished homeschooling, I've been helping families full time and also serving as government liaison for the National Council of Home Educators. So I meet with ministry staff and discuss policy and law and process and so on, as well as helping people with information around exemptions and how to get started and so on.
Wonderful. So you help families sort of transition from mainstream education into home education, or I guess basically from no education to homeschool education as well. Is that right?
Yeah, whatever situation they're in. If families come to me wanting information about how to homeschool, how to get started, how to do the paperwork, that's sort of where I come in. And also, along the way of their journey, if they have some questions about different things, life changes, things come up, they often come to me with their questions.
Awesome. And so you mentioned you had 5 children and you homeschooled all of them?
Yes.
Wow. So just out of curiosity, what are some of the biggest changes in homeschooling that you've noticed over the years?
Well, on the paperwork front, it's gotten more complex than it used to be. I think when I started homeschooling, I think our exemption applications were probably about 5 pages long. They vary depending on how good you are at putting things succinctly into words, but these days they're often up to about 20 pages long. So there's a lot more detail
Oh my goodness.
asked for. Some people can do it in 8 pages or whatever because they say things briefly, but there's a lot more information required. And the other thing that I think is a major change is that when I started, there was a lot of the people who were choosing to homeschool were doing it for sort of faith-based reasons. There was also always some with some special needs kids or some who just wanted a completely different lifestyle, but the faith-based would have been a large chunk. As time has gone by, I think there's been a bit of a change in the majority reasons for homeschooling. So the special education needs that aren't being met in school, that would be a very big portion, maybe roughly a third. We don't have exact data on this, but that's just my impression. People who are unhappy with the school system would be, a good chunk. There's certainly some faith-based ones. There's some lifestyle-based ones. There's, I guess, a lot more different reasons now, and the proportions, I think, have changed a little bit. But otherwise, homeschooling is, in a general sense, much as there's always been, a great choice for families, a lot of freedom in it, lots of great resources. And I guess that's actually another change, is that when I started, there was a limited number of resources available. And of course, we didn't have the internet, social media to discuss things with people, etc. So we had limited choices of what to use. But now there's so many choices because, particularly because the American homeschooling market is so large, that in the 90s to early 2000s, a lot of publishers of curriculum for schools saw that market opening up. So they made more resources available to the homeschool market. So that was one part of it. And of course, more of us have been experienced home educators and developed our own resources. So there's just so many more options and choices and resources and places to go for information now than there used to be.
And what are the different options for the average New Zealander wanting to homeschool here in New Zealand at the moment?
How many hours have you got?
Not that many.
I talk to literally thousands of people every year, and I always say there's as many ways to homeschool as there are homeschoolers. It's such a personal journey and such a personal choice. Now, you can divide it into sort of main groups, if you like, but everybody puts their own spin and combination on it. So when we talk about approaches to homeschooling, I liken it to a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, you have what we would call school at home type people. So they want to use a very set structured curriculum. They almost, in a sense, do something similar to school. They might have a bit of a timetable. They'll have particular books that they will work through, resources, scopes and sequences to follow, etc. So that's kind of a school at home model. The other end of the spectrum, you've got what we might call the radical unschoolers or natural learners, or they use a lot of names, free range educators, they're basically people who don't use curriculum. They want to follow their children's passions and interests, their family passions and interests, and sort of go where the child leads, in a sense, in their learning. And in between, we've got everybody else. Most people are somewhere on that spectrum. So you might have Charlotte Mason approach, which follows the ideas of a British educator from 100 odd years ago. She taught about using short structured lessons in core learning, like literacy and grammar and math and so on, but did a lot of nature-based study for science and a lot of exposure to great art and music and so on and so forth. You've got classical education, which is kind of quite structured, but has a particular philosophy and focus, and often uses Latin and introduces a lot of these higher kind of concepts, I guess, a little bit. And then you've got unit study approaches, people who want to pick a theme, something they're interested in, and focus all the learning around it. So they might be studying the seashore, and they'll read books to do with it, and they'll write stories to do with it, and they'll visit it, and they'll do experiments, and it's all thematic, basically. And a lot of us, the vast majority, I would say, are what we call eclectic. It means we pick and choose ideas out of all these different kind of approaches and put together our own package for our kids according to what they need. And I think needs change over time. Like when I look at my 5 kids, they're all very uniquely different. Some things we kind of did relatively consistently, but every now and then we kind of threw away everything we were doing and did something completely different for a while. And then for some of them, we came back to some of the original stuff with a few tweaks. Others, we've been on a completely different path. It just depends.
Wonderful. It sounds like there are a lot more options out there than maybe someone like me, the average Joe, sort of thought.
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
Here I was thinking, the options are sort of something along the lines of Takara versus unschooling versus I don't know, whatever else. But wow, sounds like there's so many more options out there.
Takara is the state correspondence school, right? So it's a registered New Zealand school. It just happens to do distance education. So the majority of people who use that, if they get in through one of the free gateways, they are not legally homeschooling. The children are learning at home, but they're using the same program, and they're instructed by teachers, and they're accountable to those teachers and so on. So they're just doing literally New Zealand school at home, right? There are now other private schools that do distance education, where again, they're not legally homeschooling, but they're learning at home, but under the auspices of the distance school. There's a few of those now. There are a few people, very small minority, who are not enrolled in Takara as a school, but choose to pay for some courses through Takara, which is an option with the homeschooling exemption. So they are legally homeschooling. They just happen to pay for, let's say, English and science through Takara. But at about $1,800 per year per subject, that's more than a lot of families would be able or willing to spend. Not all, some do use it. So it's not as straightforward. It's quite a nuanced situation. Yeah. So there's unschooling, as I mentioned before. Takara is not legally homeschooling unless you happen to have an exemption and pay for some of it. But there's all these other options, as you see. There's lots of choices.
Nice. Just back to Takara, you mentioned something about free gateways or free something.
So
what
families,
was that you're referring to?
So Takara has an enrolment policy that's set by the ministry. And so families who qualify for free Takara must fit the criteria of one of the gateways. There's a number of different gateways. The most common would be geographical isolation, where they live at least 3 kilometres or more from the nearest school or school bus route, or 4.8 kilometres of their high school age. Itineracy, where the family is moving school districts at least once a term, and so they'd have to shift schools repeatedly. Psychosocial, where there's a reason the children are not able, or the child is not able to attend school, and an educational psychologist contracted by the ministry agrees with that assessment, that perhaps they've got severe anxiety or horrific bullying in their past, or something that means they can't cope with school at the moment. There's a few others, like elite athletes and non-enrolled or excluded from school, so they have to be in a school but they can't go to the school. So those are sort of some of the main ones. There's a few others, as I said, but they're the main ones. So if your kids don't meet the criteria of one of these gateways, they cannot get free Takara. They can only use it if they want to get an exemption and pay for it. Otherwise, homeschooling is an option for a lot of those families to consider. So you can't just choose Takara.
Got you. So what would some of the considerations be that one would have to take into account before deciding which sort of homeschool route to go down, whether it's state schooling, homeschooling, unschooling, or one of the many different other types of schooling you just mentioned?
Well, this is so varied. I think the main thing to do is sit down and ask yourself, what's our vision as a family? What do we want for a child's education? How old are they? Where are they headed in the future? If they're very young, you've got plenty of time to figure that out. But if you've got an almost high school age child, you need to have a bit of a clearer idea, and that may change how you want to structure your program. Before you can do an exemption application, if homeschooling is the way you want to go, you actually have to work out your plan for the first 12 months. So you've got to think this through. So a bit of research, talking to people, what they're using, looking at some of the different philosophies online and the information about them, maybe watching some YouTube videos and figuring out what resonates with you, what sounds like how you want to approach education for your child. And if you're thinking Takara or the likes, then obviously you need to look at the enrolment policy and go, yes, I think we will meet those criteria. Let's talk to the ministry. Or no, we clearly won't meet those criteria. So that's off the table. Do we have the financial resources to consider paying for Takara or paying for an alternative private distance school? And is that what we want to do? If not, do we want to homeschool? Do we have the enthusiasm for it, the time, the resources, whatever? And I mean, that can, there's no specific requirements, just that you can teach your child as regularly and as well as they would be in school, whatever that looks like. So obviously, if you've got a full-time job and so does your spouse or partner, and there's no one to look after the kids, then homeschooling is probably not for you unless you've got someone to supervise them. So you got to look at your family situation, what you want, what your vision is, and then look at how you, if you decide homeschooling, how do I want to approach this? And a lot of families start off quite structured because they're really quite most familiar with the school model of education. And they don't necessarily have the confidence to design their own program or to go very relaxed or whatever. So they start off with let's choose some resources, particularly for English, Math, Science and Social Studies. Let's pick some resources that'll give us a guideline for the first year. As we develop confidence, as we see if this approach works for us, we can make some changes if we want to. We can bring in something different, try a different resource, drop one resource and bring in some topic-based learning. You can mix it up as you go along. You just have to have a plan to get started.
And then just sort of figure out what works for you.
We all learn as we go along. I say to the ministry all the time, home educators learn to be home educators by home educating. It's not like we go to school for 3 years and get a degree in home education before we start, right? We kind of have to figure it out as we go along.
Isn't it? Yeah. Oh, very true. Now, you mentioned something about an exemption. So what sort of situations would that be required in, or as opposed to what situations would it not be required in? Because a 20-page exemption sounds pretty intimidating.
I know it does. It's not as bad as you think, because once you start getting your ideas and you start writing them out and you start answering the questions, it just, it flows. So the law says that all children from their 6th birthday through until they turn 16 must be enrolled in and attending a registered school. The only exceptions to that is if they are exempt, basically. And so to be exempt, you have to apply for an exemption. And the exemption is simply the parent applying to the ministry, demonstrating that they have a plan to teach the child at least as regularly and well as they would be taught in school. Now, that's as far as the legal definition goes, as regularly and well. It's not defined any further than that. However, the ministry obviously puts together a form, puts together some questions for you to provide information that they can gauge whether it looks like this child will be taught as regularly and as well, because they have to be, quoting the law, satisfied that they will be in order to grant the exemption. So the application is something that you complete, and the ministry has a form, and it's not very user-friendly, to be fair, or to be honest. No. So you can use their form or you cannot use their form. That is your choice, as long as you cover all the required information. So their form has 4 parts. Section 1 is family data, name, address, student's date of birth, where you live, blah, 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 blah. That I would suggest you use the form for, because it has a legal declaration, privacy statement that must be used. It's only 3 pages and you can fill it in on the form. The next part, section 2, is the as well as part. And this is the most detailed part. So they're asking, what are you planning to do for the next 12 months? What subjects will you teach? how will you teach them? What will you teach within the subject? So basically, what are they going to be taught? How are they going to be taught or learn if you take a child-led approach? What are your goals for the first 12 months? What do you want to see them learn or see them achieve? And how will you know if they're doing it? How will you know they're making progress? How will you monitor their learning, etc.? And what resources will you use to support this? So that's sort of the biggest chunk. Then there's a question that asks you for a topic plan. So a topic plan is one example of how you would put together and deliver a unit of learning. It can be anything you want, anything from a math lesson to a project on bees to whatever. But it has to have certain things. It has to have a topic, about how long you think it will take, what your main learning goals are for it, what steps will be taken in this learning, what resources you'll use, and how you'll know that it's been successful. So, that might be half a page long, 2 pages long, depending on, how you write that up. Those are the main things they ask in section 2. Section 3 is the regularly section. So they want to know what is your routines or timetable or however you want to write this up. But how can you show us that you plan to regularly teach your child? How often will they do math in a typical week, etc., that kind of thing. Section 4 is completely optional. It's just, is there anything else you want to tell us? If so, write it here. I never use section 4 myself. But so basically, section 1 data, section 2 and 3, the main stuff, section 4, forget about it. And that's your exemption application in a nutshell.
Wow. I could tell from the way that you're speaking about it that you have gone through this process so many times with people, and it seems to be flowing quite easily from what I'm hearing, although I'm also hearing it sounds very, very complicated at the same time, especially for someone.
It can be time consuming for someone who's new to it. And I think the hardest part is the decision making, the thinking through. What do I want to do? And I say to people, look, just pick one subject at a time. Think about one learning area. Learning area is another term for subject. Think about a simple one to start with. Health and PE, right? That has 2 parts. How will your child be physically active? And what health topics will you teach them about? So physically active, is your child in a sports team? Do they like to climb trees, ride a bike, swim in the sea? Do you play soccer every Saturday? What is it that they do that will get them active? And you simply describe that. Health topics, and this is often just conversational. We regularly talk to Johnny about personal hygiene, stranger danger, basic first aid, nutrition and healthy food choices, and so on, right? It depends on their age, obviously. If they're an older child, you'd be talking about adolescence and body changes and, sexual education and all that kind of stuff. You don't have to go into detail, just a brief description.
Yeah.
See, we have some physical activity. See, we talk about some health topics. Oh, and we've got this book for them to read, or we're going to read with them about whatever it is, birth or something. And that's kind of all you need to talk about for health and PE, apart from maybe having one goal. This year we want to, increase his swimming abilities so he can swim a full length without having to stand up and take a breath. I don't know, something simple. It's not complicated. Okay, so you sort of, and when you look at it like that, it's not so hard, right? And then you look at, okay, so the arts, music, art, dance, drama, which of these will my child do? What will they look like? Do we have art and craft supplies? Does someone in the house play a musical instrument? Are they going to have music lessons? Do they like to sing and dance to YouTube? Do they like to act out little plays and dramas and what have you? You don't have to do all of these things, but you talk about what it is that you do, what they enjoy, and what you want to extend on, or what you plan to do.
Are there many people like yourself out there that people can reach out to if they're having any problems?
Yeah. So I've been doing it the longest, and I'm the only person who does this full time. But there are a few other homeschooling mums with quite a bit of experience that do support people through exemption applications. Yeah.
Now, are there any special sort of skills or things that parents kind of need, any special training or anything that they need to become home educators?
No, as I said, we all learn as we go along. Obviously, being a parent, knowing your children, giving some thought to what you want to do, that's important. But you do learn as you go along. There's homeschooling conferences, there's regional groups you can go along to. There's lots of YouTube videos, there's books you can read, there's lots out there. And it's all what we would term professional development. expose yourself to these things. You read, you listen, you talk, you ask questions, and you learn more and more, both before you start and as you go along on the journey.
And is there many options out there for families who are sort of seeking some sort of support, whether it be financial support for homeschooling or supplies or anything like that?
So when you choose to home educate, you're basically taking full responsibility for all of that yourself. There is, however, a small government allowance you can choose to accept if you wish. Every 6 months after you've got an exemption, they send you a piece of paper to sign. It's a simple declaration that says, yes, I've been homeschooling and teaching my child as regularly and as well as for the last 6 months, or part thereof if you've just started, and I'm planning to continue for the next six months, or I plan to stop at this date or whatever. And then there's a second page that says, would you like the homeschooling allowance? If yes, sign, tick this, sign here. And the allowance at the moment is $700 and my mind is going to go blank. $730, $40 a year for the eldest child, 600 and something for the second. It reduces per child, and they pay it divided in half every 6 months. I can give you the exact figures. I've got them just over here.
And that's basically
for the eldest child, 632 for the second, 521 for the third, and 372. This is per annum for the fourth and subsequent children. Now there will be a slight increase next year. It's the first time in 30 years they've increased it. And it's something we're working on. So those, you can do whatever you like with that money. It's a non-taxable grant. So some people use it for resources, obviously. Others just use it for whatever they like. They can use it to go on a holiday,
fair
or
enough,
or whatever.
Now, can children be homeschooled if they are living sort of 100% off grid? I've heard there's quite a big online component, especially for the older children with homeschooling.
No required online access whatsoever. So if they were doing Takara, that does involve online learning because that's how they deliver the program for the most part. But anything else you can do as you like. We lived completely off grid in the Marlborough Sounds for a number of years of our homeschooling.
Wow.
So we had a party line phone and we didn't have internet whatsoever. It's entirely possible.
Oh,
fact,
that's
sometimes
awesome.
It's the best years.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you there. Now, sorry, I'm just reading through some of the questions I had written down here. What are the minimum requirements needed if you want to homeschool? Like, is there sort of special equipment you need at home, a special sort of setting? What is required for your home setting?
Some pens and pencils, some paper, a library card. That would be about the minimum requirements.
Now, regarding a library card, I'm only asking out of my past experience because I've had a lot of trouble getting a library card myself in the last 3 or 4 years because I live and travel in a motorhome on the road and I don't have a physical address. Do you know of anything available to others who may be living on the road like myself?
Okay. So when I said a library card, I was just meaning that in a general sense of some way of accessing some resources. Okay, you didn't actually have to have a library card. I mean, these days you can do ebooks online. You can look things up online. Back when we homeschooled, that wasn't an option, so you went to the library and got books out about whatever you were learning about. So that's that's not a strict requirement at all. But I mean, it just depends. There are some regional homeschooling groups that have their own libraries. Not many of them, but there's one in the Manawatu, and a couple of other regions. It would depend. I think to get a library card, obviously some sort of base is necessary, or you can join a lot of regional libraries as a visitor, but they may charge you to take things out. Some regions will go, yes, but you have to pay $2 per book out or whatever. But that's still a cheaper than buying the book, isn't it? As long as you're doing it. I think we still have library memberships in about 5 different regions of the country because we've lived in many different places and we've got different ones. But it's something you'd have to work out as you go along. But as I said, there's online resources these days.
No, awesome. Now, there's a bit of concern out there in the general population regarding socialization for homeschooled students. What does socialization look like for those who are homeschooled?
This is a question that has always been asked. What about socialization? I don't know if you saw just recently, there was a study done by one of the big universities in America, Harvard, I think it was, and one done by the Israelis, because with all of their lockdowns and everything over there, homeschooling is growing considerably. They've demonstrated that kids who are homeschooled have better social adaptation and better social skills than those in state schools. Really? Something we knew all along, but they proved it now.
Wow.
So what does homeschooling look like? There seems to be this strange belief that if you homeschool kids, either you lock them in a cupboard and they never see the light of day, hypothetically speaking, or or the only way to be socialized is to sit in a classroom with 30 of your peers of the same age. That's not socialization, right? When we go out in the real world, we interact with a range of people of all ages. And we can do that when we're homeschooling within family groups, within local community, within homeschooling groups, with our friends. Just because you start homeschooling doesn't mean you lose all of your previous friends. You can still get together with them and you make new ones. You go along to social groups. My youngest daughter, she's quite a social kid. She was always rounding up kids in the neighborhood and bringing them home. And when she was, I think, 8, she said, "Mum, I want to have 20 of my friends over for a sleepover for my birthday."
Oh my goodness.
Like, where are we going to put 20 kids? We have this little wee house. And she goes, "Oh, we'll just get a marquee and put it on the back lawn and put mattresses in it." We don't have a marquee, sweet pea. Good
on her. Very imaginative.
And she was in soccer teams and she did local camps and she went to homeschooling activities. I mean, all the kids have as much social contact as they want to have, really. And I mean, if you live more remotely, you have a smaller family, you've got to be a bit more deliberate. You've got to put a bit of effort into providing your kids with these opportunities, for sure. But there are plenty of opportunities out there. When we moved to the North Island after having lived quite remotely in the South for a long time, suddenly we were in a local group where there was activities we could access all the time. And so we went to art group and swimming lessons and geography group and this and that. And about the third weekend, my middle child said, "Mum, could we just stay home a bit more? We're going out too much." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay." I swung a bit too far in that direction, so we toned it down. So, you've got to have time.
How do you find these groups? These groups to socialise with?
So Nchens, which is NCHENZ, National Council of Home Educators in New Zealand. It's a great website, .org.nz. On there is a support tab, and under there's regional groups, and you can just go on there. There's a list divided by region with links to either Facebook pages or websites or email addresses depending on the group, and you can find your local groups. They're all the ones
does it matter what sort of homeschooling method that you're doing?
No, some groups are specific, like there'll be an unschooling group, for instance, perhaps, or an autism support group or whatever, although it's more on Facebook that you find the quite specific support groups. Most regional groups welcome any type of homeschooler.
Yeah.
Some have a flavour to them, but yeah.
And what would a typical day of homeschooling look like? Like, are you big on routines, no routines? Does it depend on the child? I suppose it does depend on the child and the family.
It depends on the child and the family, right? So
what would the average day look like?
It depends on the family and their approach. But if I give you a couple of examples from my own children, perhaps. So one of my daughters might get up at, I might say to them, right, I want you guys starting on your schoolwork, your actual assigned coursework by about 9 o'clock, right? And some days they get up and they get started at 9 and they finish their core work by, depending on their age, of course, but 11, 12, 1 o'clock, depending on how old they were and how much they're doing. Other days they might be like, "You know what, I really want to work on that quilting project today, so I'm going to get up at 6 and get all my schoolwork done by 8 so I can spend the rest of the day gardening, cooking, quilting, climbing trees," whatever it is, right? So kids get quite self-motivated when they know, okay, yes, mum said I have to do these things, but I can get them out of the way and then I can go and do this other thing. And this is an advantage to homeschooling, because in the class, it doesn't matter if you finish your schoolwork in the first 10 minutes of the 1 hour period, you're still stuck there with those kids till the end of the period. Not in homeschooling, right? I've done this subject, I move on to the next one, right? I get it done, unless I need mum's help with something. And then I can go and do other things. So my middle child, he's ADHD, and he would wake up in the morning with his head full of ideas, could not focus on any schoolwork until he'd carried some of them out. So he used to get up in the morning and go and build a tree house or dig a mine under the ground or mow the lawn or create a costume and act out a play, or round up the kids in the neighbourhood who also homeschool and direct a movie or whatever. But when he got all that out of his system, then he'd come and sit down with me after lunch and we'd do, some of his core bookwork. So you have that flexibility. And there were times where we were having a particular focus for the term. So we were doing a thing called Student Convention a couple of years, which is where we got together with other kids to do particular competitions for the term. And so in preparation for that, we'd be doing a lot of science projects and preparing dramatic presentations and doing quilting and doing all these other things. And so we'd set aside our regular bookwork for a few weeks and focus on preparation for this thing, right? With the specific things the kids are doing. So again, you've got different times of the different seasons of the year, different times in your life, different ages in your kids, different needs at different times. So you just arrange things according to those needs. And some families like to start their morning with what's popularly called morning basket, or family circle, or cuddle on the couch and read a good book time, depends on how you approach it, where you gather all the kids together and maybe you do some poetry, or you're reading a particular book aloud, or you are doing some oral lessons together and discussion and maybe setting some tasks for the day, and then the kids might go off and do different things they're working on, and then you come back together later. My kids loved me reading aloud to them, and it's one of the things I value most about homeschooling. So we often started the day off with something, and I'd leave the end of the chapter would be a nice cliffhanger. You can't have any more until you've gone and done these other things, and then we come back together later in the day and just read to our heart's content. Lots of different things at different times.
Wonderful. That sounds awesome. For those who may already be homeschooling at the moment, one of the concerns that I hear a lot from people is that they're struggling to motivate their children to actually do their schoolwork. What would be some tips or advice that you could give these people?
I think with that, the first question is why? Why are they not motivated? How old are they? How long have you been homeschooling? One of the issues that some people strike is they take their kids out of school and they jump straight into homeschooling and expect to just transition from one to the other just like that. And the kids often need some downtime to lose that ingrained sense of how school's supposed to look through the school system. They call it a deschooling period. So this is a time where you focus on family relationships, focus on household routines, focus on letting them explore things they're interested in to hopefully rediscover their love of learning, and be ready to engage in more structured learning if that's the direction you're going. So sometimes it's just that people have tried to transition too quickly and not allowed that unwinding time. Sometimes it's because the approach they're using isn't quite right for their child. So parents might get really enthusiastic about an unschooling approach, for instance, where their child is supposed to get enthused about different things, and then they're going to follow their child's lead and support them in learning. But some kids just don't work that way, right? Especially if they've been in school for a number of years. They don't have that self-drive to pick up on something and get enthused about it. So that maybe they need to modify their approach. Some kids actually like to be told what to do next, right? In other cases, you've got a kid or a teenager perhaps who's suffering from some self-confidence issues, some anxiety, missing their friends, whatever's going on. You've really got to sit down with these kids and talk to them, not just once, but engage with them. What is going on here? In some cases, it's simply that the children are not used to doing what the parents tell them to do. And that may be a family relationship, discipline, structure, whatever issue that they need to figure out. And sometimes if you try working through all this stuff with your kids and they're still just flatly refusing to do anything, sometimes you have to sit down and have a hard conversation with them. Look, child, learning is not actually optional, right? If you refuse to engage in learning at home, then as a parent responsible for your education, I might have to send you back to school, right? Now, do you want to stay learning at home? How do we make this work together, right? What are you struggling with? How can we modify this? But I mean, as a parent, you are legally responsible to see that your child gets educated in some reasonable sense that's going to work for them. And of course, as parents, we all want what's best for our kids. We want to launch them into adulthood with the skills and the attributes and the character traits to do well, right? And that can look, education can look so different in different circumstances. But if they're resisting, kids cannot think into the future. They cannot really fully comprehend the results of today's actions in the way that we as adults can. So we have to help them with that. We have to do it for them in a sense and talk them through it. And sometimes we have to put our foot down too. So it just depends on why.
Part and parcel of being a parent, hey?
It is.
We got all the fun stuff to do as well.
Yeah.
Now,
yes, you must clean your teeth.
Just sharing a little story from my own homeschooling journey with my daughter. Just as you mentioned, you'd have to send them back to school if they were not, wanting to participate in learning at home. And this was a conversation I had with my daughter a couple of times, where she was actually very keen to get back to mainstream education, to get back to a mainstream school in her head.
Mm-hmm.
But it was funny because every morning she would wake up and snuggle her dog in bed in her pajamas, grab out her laptop, start her work without even leaving her bed. And she just, I think the thought of actually having to get up and make herself motivated to get back to school in the mornings was actually more of a scary thought than just doing your work in bed in the mornings. So that worked out really well. But yeah, it was definitely a conversational three.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I struggled with when I was homeschooling, I didn't homeschool for very long, and it was through Takara, but something I struggled with was keeping track of their progress. Do you have any tips for keeping track of progress? Like, they go through different modules and different learning things. How do you keep track of it all? What stage you're at?
Takara is a little different because that's being set by someone else, and it's their job to actually, mark their work and so on. So it does depend on what you're doing and how you're approaching it. So if you're doing some sort of learning that involves a textbook or a workbook or whatever, there's going to be regular marking of that. There's likely an answer guide or whatever. So it's pretty clear, yes, they got this math problem right or they got it wrong. You can track progress that way. Other things are a bit more subjective and a bit more conversational through observation of the child, discussion with them, and this is where setting some goals actually helps. When you set goals for your child, whether in the exemption or later on, it's not necessarily saying my child must achieve these things, right? It's saying, I think that by the end of the next 12 months, this is probably where they'll be at, right? And then you've got something to look back at as a benchmark and go, okay, they're still working towards that, but they're making progress, right? Or we achieved that 6 months ago, right? And we've moved on to this. Or yes, they're kind of on par for that, and we've just finished that or whatever. It just kind of gives you an idea. Now, some people find it useful to have an outside kind of scope of what those benchmarks might look like. And so the New Zealand curriculum documents are all free to access online. There's a website called TKI, and there's a document there called Achievement Objectives by Level. And it goes through from year 1 to year 13 in the New Zealand curriculum, what learning outcomes would look like level by level. Now, some people find those helpful as a reference, not because you're going to follow the New Zealand curriculum necessarily, although you might, but because you can say, okay, so at this level, they should be understanding that a book starts at the beginning and goes to the end, and we read left to right and what have you. But at this level, they're able to look at this text and compare ideas in them, or whatever the case may be, right? Other people find that document written in a bunch of edu speak that might as well be Greek and they don't understand it at all, and that is totally okay. Right? Let's be real here. I prefer a thing called the World Book Typical Course of Study, and you can find that online, again, free to access. It goes through by American grade levels, so you got to remember that grade 2 is our year 3 and so on. But you can click on each one and it goes through learning area or subject by subject, and it lists typical things that kids would learn or be able to do at that level, right? And it's written in quite plain English. So sometimes you can go through something like that and pick out some ideas. You don't have to do everything, right? But you can pick out some ideas or just use it as a bit of a checklist. Oh, yeah, we've covered that kind of stuff. Yes, they can do that. Perhaps we should work on this, right? And it's just helpful kind of benchmarks to kind of help you know that, yes, we're progressing along some sort of, sequence. But a lot of it's just watching your kids, observing them, are we using new language? Are we confident when we do this? Can they get their maths problems right? Can they write in an appropriate level? Do they use, the right punctuation, capitalization, or Are they using, can they write an essay? Depends how old they are, obviously. It's progress. Progress, not perfection, I think is what we're all aiming for.
I like that. Progress, not perfection. That's a good one. So what would you say is one of the biggest hurdles at the beginning to getting into homeschooling for new parents? What would you say? The exemption application. So that is probably the hardest thing to overcome.
I think the first time you do it, right, it is tricky because you're faced with this hurdle you've got to jump over. And a lot of people are put off by it, but I actually say to people, look, it may seem big, but it's a useful process because it forces you to think about your plans to the point you can articulate them to get the exemption, right? So it is a useful process. Other than that, I think it's, for a lot of people, it's self-confidence. It's confidence that, yes, I can do this. We have these voices ringing in our heads that this is what education is supposed to look like. They'll be unsocialized. We won't be able to teach them to read. We'll fail, we'll ruin them for life. I got told those kinds of things by unhelpful people in my life. Often it's just that confidence to actually, we can do this, and it doesn't have to look like just what's at school, and they will turn out okay. They might not all learn to read when they're 6, but it'll all work out in the long run. I mean, I get to sit at this vantage point where all my kids are adults and see how awesome they all are and how well they've all done, even though most of them had learning difficulties. None of them learned on what you'd call a straight line of checking all the boxes all the way through. The pathway was more meandering, and it was different for each one. And there were days where I tore my hair out and cried and thought, what on earth am I doing? I mean, we all have those moments in parenting.
Sounds like normal parenting.
Exactly. How am I going to survive this child? It's just in homeschooling, it's kind of like you're under a little bit of a microscope in your own life. So when you send your kids off to school all day, you're passing the buck of responsibility for their education to someone else, right? A lot of parents have no idea what's going on, what they're actually teaching, learning, how they're doing, whatever. But you're also, when you have them at home, personality traits, personality issues, behavioral issues, bad habits in the children and in yourself become much more obvious, right? You have to live with each other. And so that magnifies those things. So often a portion of home education isn't about math and English, right? It's about character. It's about getting along together. It's about dealing with issues. The kids model you.
It sounds like relationship building to me. It is, not a bad thing at all.
Somebody said to me way back when I started homeschooling, they said, if you don't have your children's respect and you can't instruct them, you'll never be able to homeschool them, right? First, you have to build that family relationship, that whole culture of working together and of appropriate obedience and appropriate support and so on and so forth. Because if you don't have that, you've got no foundation to teach them and guide them without constantly butting heads with each other. So and sometimes that's what, kind of harking back to your earlier question, when you can't motivate the kids and what have you. Sometimes it's actually that you need to put aside the bookwork for a few months even and focus on family and character and all of that.
So you mentioned the biggest barrier for new families to overcome when coming into homeschooling is the exemption. And I'm just wondering, how often do you have to apply for that exemption? Is it a yearly thing or just once?
Just once. So if you apply if they apply when they turn 6 and you continue to homeschool all the way through, you never have to apply again. It remains in force until they turn 16, right? If, however, you send them back to school for more than a period of 10 weeks, so we're allowed a 10-week school trial where you can send them back to school for up to a term, basically, to see if that's where they want to go, and then you can return to homeschooling without having to redo the exemption. But if you take longer than that, you need a new exemption if you pull them back out of school after going back to school. So the law says that the exemption remains in force either until they're 16 or they're enrolled in a registered school, whichever comes first. So so if you continue right through, it's a once only. So it's a big deal, but it's only one time.
So do you have to update your teaching plan every year or anything?
No.
Oh, that is awesome. That's really cool.
The only way. I mean, you should for yourself, right? I would sit down at the beginning of each year and go, okay, what do we want? But it's all for me, right? It's not for anybody else. So they send you the 6-monthly declaration, which I mentioned before, just to say, yes, we are, and yes, we'll continue. That's the main way they continue to check up on you that you're still doing it. There is the possibility of an ERO review, but they are quite rare because the current government policy, and has been for quite some years, is that they only fund up to 35 reviews, that's students being reviewed per year for the whole country. And typically they've only been doing around 10. Now, if you think about it, we've now got 12,000 students that are exempt homeschooling in New Zealand, around that number. And out of those, they could potentially review up to 35. Now, how do they pick those 35? Well, because there's not like a lottery where they draw a name out of the hat. What they do is they reserve those for ones where they think there's a problem. And the only reason they think there's a problem is if somebody goes to the ministry and says, hey, I'm a bit concerned about little Johnny's learning. I don't think he's being taught properly, right? Now, that might be a family member, a neighbour, busybody up the street, a government agency that happens to get involved for some reason, whatever. So if they go to the ministry and they say, hey, I'm worried about Johnny's learning, the ministry then go to the parents and say, somebody's expressed concern. Can you give us an update, right? And so basically that's when you go to the ministry. Okay, well, in fact, I don't think there's a problem because we're now doing this, this, and this, and Johnny's doing really well with this, and we're working on this, and you're just kind of giving them a brief update, kind of like a mini version of the exemption, not really, but just a brief sort of update. And if they look at that and go, well, obviously everything's fine, that's it, they close the file. If they're not sure if everything's fine, then they would refer it to ERO for a review, and that's when you would have an ERO review. And so that's the only time where you'd have to present to somebody, here's evidence of my child's learning, this is what we're doing, this is our plans, this is my record keeping, all that kind of stuff. Now, whether there'll be changes to that system in the future, it's possible because it always comes down to government funding, government policy. But it's been that way since, I think it was 2009, the last time they changed it. Before that, we used to have semi-routine reviews. But yeah, it's not a huge deal.
Have you noticed any recent increases or decreases in the popularity of homeschooling in New Zealand?
Sure. I've obviously, in the last 2 years, it's taken off, thanks to the COVID situation for a variety of reasons. So we've gone from pre-COVID, I think we had, if memory serves, around 7,000 exempt kids. And now we've got, I haven't got the latest figures, but it would be around 12,000 based on.
Wow, that's a huge jump. That's amazing. I guess if anything, these
don't know how many will continue. Sorry?
Yes. Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think one thing this lockdown has sort of brought to the people of New Zealand and around the world is, I guess, a newfound level of confidence that they can, in fact, school their children at home, whereas they probably wouldn't have considered it before, which I think is really cool. It's, you get a bit of a taste for it, and it's, might work for you, might not. Now, I just have one last question for you, Cynthia, and I apologise if we've sort of gone over the amount of time that you're available. I'm sure you have other things on. But I just wanted to discuss any options to make the process easier on those wanting to apply. So you mentioned you offer a service. Is that to help with exemptions? Is this a free service, a paid service?
So I have a website, cynthiahancox.com. On there, there's lots of information you can freely access about homeschooling and how to get started in the process. I do offer some resources that have a small charge attached to them. So I have, probably come up in reverse on here, I don't know. So this is a manual I wrote on homeschooling exemption applications, and it walks people through the process of what is required, some examples. Beautiful. There's a template that comes with it you can use to write your own. Lots and lots of info and guidance in there. That's $25. Everyone tells me it's cheap as, and it helps them heaps. I also more recently put together this one, Planning Your Home Education Program. So this one goes through curriculum options and other ways of teaching each learning area. And the idea is that it just briefly summarises a bit about lots of different resources, and then has links to where you can find more if that sounds like something you want to look at. And it tells you where you can purchase it, whether it's a New Zealand supplier or you get it from overseas or it's downloadable or whatever. So that's just to help people who are figuring out what they're starting. I also work with families one-on-one. So some families will write their own exemption application, either using my guide or not, either's fine. and then come to me and ask me to review it. So I'll read it through and I'll give them feedback and constructive pointers as to what else they might need to do before they send it to the ministry. And I do charge a fee for that. Not a huge amount. And other families want me to actually help them write it. So there's fees for that as well. And other families have put an application into the ministry and then run into some hiccups. So they come to me then and say, hey, how do I deal with this? And I will support them through that process, understanding the requirements and so on. So, and it's always, even with the families I'm helping write it, it's a collaborative process, because it's not, it has to be their plans, their ideas. I can guide them, but they have to make their own decisions. And then I can help them put the information together.
Beautiful. So that website was www.cynthiahancox.com. Is that right?
Yeah. So Cynthia Hancox, Hancox. I probably should have put my full name on the screen, but
no, that's fine. I'll add a link in the description to this live just so people can access that if they want to. But Cynthia, thank you so much for coming on here today and sharing your knowledge and expertise and advice on this topic. I obviously am not right up there, but I know a lot of people are interested in knowing more. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. Thank you so much, Cynthia.
You're very welcome.
All right, well, I'll let you go off and enjoy the rest of your afternoon and maybe catch up another time. But thank you so much. Have a great night and we'll see you later.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. All right, guys, that was awesome. So that was Cynthia Hancox, who's a home educator here in New Zealand. And she's spent a long time working and being involved in the home education sector here in New Zealand from the sounds of things. Really awesome sort of pillar of knowledge there. So again, if you didn't catch that, her website is www.cynthiahancox, that's Hancox, Hancox.com, and there's a lot of stuff, resources and things there, and you can even reach out to her through her website if you need to. So ngā mihi whānau, have a great afternoon, ko Māori e.